Now, strangely enough, this curious little story makes its appearance in two places in the New Testament. The first is in St. Paul's letter to the Romans, where St. Paul says the following: "What then shall we say to this? If God is for us, who is against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, will he not also give us all things with him?" It's that little phrase, "he who did not spare his own son." For quite a long time, people thought that that referred to the passage which we looked at in our last session. You remember when Abraham didn't quite sacrifice Isaac. But in fact, the Greek words in St. Paul and the Greek text of that passage in Genesis don't have the words in common. The parallel is to this passage with the Gibeonites. What St. Paul is saying was that God was not like King David. Remember how frightened the Gibeonites were of King David. But in fact, King David was generous. But God is much more generous than King David. King David, after all, didn't give up his own son. He gave up someone else's sons, which is an awfully convenient thing for him to do. He said, God is not like King David. He's even better, much more generous. The Gibeonites had to break through their suspicions of King David and find that he was more generous than they thought. Well, David was a complete trickster compared to God, who gave up his own son, which, as a good monotheist, St. Paul would have understood to mean himself, for us all. So St. Paul uses this text that we've seen as an example of a movement of generosity towards people who need their wrath satisfied. Do you see? The movement of sacrifice is from God to people. God is offering a sacrifice to us, not the other way around. And just to show that St. Paul is not alone in this, there's another little reference to this story in St. John's Gospel. Those of you who have ever sung the Passion on a Good Friday ceremony in a church know that there's a certain moment at which Pilate brings Jesus out for the trial. He's comes to a place which is called in Greek the pavement, or lithostraton, or in Hebrew Gabbatha. And it's strange, it's one of the very few times in St. John's Gospel when a Hebrew word, in fact it's an Aramaic word, gets put in the text. And it's usually to call your attention to something. So this place which is called in Greek the pavement, or in Hebrew Gabbatha. And it's there that Pilate proceeds to hand Jesus over to the crowd. Now, the phrase Gabbatha means mound of Gibeah. So it's the same mound that's being referred to as the one in which David handed over the sons of Saul to the people. Do you see that the same movement is being brought out? The notion of God giving someone that he loves, in this case himself, into the hands of wrathful people. There is a violent divinity in this equation, and it is us. That's the purpose of this is going out. From complete generosity into the midst of people who need their violence assuaged.